Welcome to the World War II Discussion Forum's Winter and Spring Series lecture. I'm excited to be joined by our speaker today, Doug Most. Before I introduce him, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker, or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking the question. We'll take about 15 or 20 minutes of questions and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. Second, donations are always appreciated. Please note there's a donate tab on the website. Third, we now have a YouTube channel, and as I mentioned, this talk is being recorded for that. Please see the icon at the top of the website to access it, and I should have it posted by the end of today. Fourth and finally, you can send any feedback to the website at wwiidf.org. Now to this afternoon's speaker, someone I'm thrilled to have. Doug Most is a veteran journalist in Massachusetts, a native of Rhode Island, the author of 3 books, and now the executive editor and assistant vice president at Boston University. He worked at newspapers in Washington, D.C., South Carolina, and New Jersey. He spent 15 years as magazine and features editor at the Boston Globe and has had feature stories appear in Best American Sports Writing and Best American Crime Writing. His latest book, Launching Liberty, which he'll speak about today, tells the human story behind that epic race to build the Liberty ships of World War II. His previous books include The Race Underground, which is a narrative history of Boston and New York, struggling with dangerously overcrowded neighborhoods, as well as a documentary that was optioned from this book called The Race Underground. As I mentioned this afternoon, Doug's going to address or talk about his most recent book, Launching Liberty, the epic race to build ships that took America to war. The reviews have been stellar. There's a number of reviews just looking at Amazon. I'm just going to read some highlights. One from David Marinis, who doesn't need any real introduction, who writes, Launching Liberty, Doug Most has brilliantly illuminated an important and undervalued step in how America prepared for its fight against fascism, while historian Walter Bornemann, who's needs no introduction as well, concludes, more than anything, Launching Liberty is the story of how to get tough things done. Not always pretty, rarely perfect, but an achievement over daunting challenges nonetheless. Doug Most skillfully delivers a tribute to American know-how and provides an instructive account of how America at all levels responded to crises, united in common purpose, and accomplished the seemingly impossible. With that, I'm thrilled to have Doug, and I'll turn it over to him.
Thanks, Greg. I really appreciate it, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As I told Greg before, I've done a number of events and talks since the book came out late in the summer, early fall, and I've done virtual events like this and podcasts and webinars and in-person talks, and so it's always fun to just sort of mix up the way that I like to reach different audiences and tell the story of this book. So a couple of things I'm going to do. I'm going to tell a couple of very personal stories, which I hopefully will sort of illuminate for you folks what it was like to sort of research and write this book, and then I'm going to get into some of the characters in the book. But I think these stories will sort of help personalize the story that I'm going to share with you. So Launching Liberty. So this is a story about, one could argue, boring, hulking, steel, slow cargo ships. And it may not seem like a exciting or sort of even interesting story, but one of the things that I learned in researching this was it really was the story of something that dramatically changed the course of World War II for us. Without the Liberty ships, don't think this is an overstatement to say this. Without the Liberty ships of World War II, the war ends very differently. I don't think that's without question. So 2 stories I want to share with you. So I started researching this book in around 2020. So we all know what was going on in 2020. The COVID pandemic was happening, and it was a crazy time in the world. I spent about 2 or 3 years researching this book and this subject. And up until 2023, my research essentially amounted to books, journal articles, papers, illustrations, blueprints, everything you can imagine. World War II, there's a voluminous amount of material out there. I was looking at archive materials. I was looking in places where personal papers are being held, all these different places. But my research was very two-dimensional. Everything about the Liberty ship, and I felt like by that point I was an expert on the Liberty ship. And yet there was something about my research that felt missing, felt a little hollow, because it was very two-dimensional. It was all on my computer. I'd interviewed a few people, but that was sort of it. There are two floating Liberty ships left in this country. One is in San Francisco Harbor, and the other, and that's the USS Jeremiah O'Brien, or the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, I should say. And the second floating Liberty ship left is in Baltimore, just outside of downtown Baltimore, the SS John W. Brown. Those are the two sort of remaining floating Liberty ships that are really something you can visit and see and even walk on and experience. And that's 2 out of 2,710 that were built during World War II, just to give you some perspective. So 2 left floating out of 2,710 that were built. So in the summer of 2023, I decided I needed to change my two-dimensional perspective on the Liberty ship to make it three-dimensional. And by that, I needed to go experience the Liberty ship. I contacted the SS John W. Brown in Baltimore. There's a guy there who was very helpful and kind and friendly. He's a retired firefighter who essentially is the caretaker of the ship. And he agreed to sort of give me a personal tour. And so in the summer of 2023, I drove down to Baltimore from Boston, not a long drive, maybe 5 hours. And I have a vivid memory to this day of driving down this sort of gravelly road and parking my car and turning around and saying like, oh, there's the Liberty ship right there, right next to me. And the first thing I was struck by when I saw the SS John W. Brown was how long it was. So a Liberty ship, just to give you some dimensions here, Liberty ships were built, they were 441 feet in length, 441 feet. So how long is that? So a football field is somewhere around 300 feet or a little longer than that. So if a football field is a little longer than 300 feet, now you walk the length of an entire football field and then walk an extra 100 feet or so. Now you get the idea of how long a Liberty ship was. So they're very long. But what I was really struck by, and you can see this in the picture on the screen here with the cover of the book, is the depth of the Liberty ship, how tall it was. So they're equivalent to about a 10-story building. And the depth of the Liberty ship really was, in essence, the key to what made them so valuable to the war. So after walking the length of the Liberty ship on the ground, I walked up the gangplank and I met the guy who was going to give me a tour of the ship. And he took me into the deck house of the ship first, sort of the place where the ship is steered from and where it's navigated from, where the compass is, where the radio room is, where the bunk beds were, where the crew slept, where the mess hall was. That deck house is almost like the equivalent of a 3-story building. And sort of he took me into there and we spent some time there just giving a tour of that. He then took me into the engine room, which was also great to see and sort of interesting. And then after that, we walked down a metal staircase, a winding, steep metal staircase in the middle of the ship, kept going down and down and down and down and down until we essentially were on the floor of the ship. And then he took me toward the front. I'm going to put up a diagram here just to sort of show you what I'm talking about. Here we go. So Liberty ships had 5 cargo holds. And these cargo holds were really what made them so valuable. So when I was on the ship, we walked over to cargo hold number 2 that you can see here on this diagram. And we walked into this. It was empty because the ship is obviously not full of cargo. And when I walked into this cargo hold and sort of looked up, I was really struck in a dramatic way by how vast and how big this cargo hold was. It was feeling like I was in an empty warehouse in this one room. So to give you a sense of just how much cargo a Liberty ship could hold in World War II, okay? One Liberty ship, a single Liberty ship, could hold 440 tanks. One Liberty ship, 440 tanks. Another number, one Liberty ship could also hold 2,800 jeeps. So think about how valuable the jeeps were in the war and navigating terrain and all of that. 2,800 jeeps onto one Liberty ship. Or here's one more perspective, a 2-mile long boxcar train. We've all been stuck at a crossing where the boxcar train is crossing. A 2-mile long boxcar train carried the equivalent of one Liberty ship. So now imagine a whole fleet of 2,700 Liberty ships, and you get a real feel for the vast amount of cargo that a fleet of Liberty ships could carry. So when I was standing inside this cargo hold and sort of just allowed myself to just sort of picture the war and to visualize what was happening, I closed my eyes for a minute, and I had seen videos and pictures of huge cranes lowering tanks and boxes of cargo into these cargo holds. I'd watched and seen pictures of things. But now here I was standing in a cargo hold. This is where it happened. And for the first time, I think, standing in that cargo hold of the SS John W. Brown, I sort of found myself realizing that in many ways, this is where the war was won. Nothing will ever diminish from what our troops and what the military did during the war, of course, right? Nothing can ever take away from that. But you have to remember that war was fought overseas, over 2 giant oceans, in Europe, in Russia, in North Africa. It was fought in all these different countries without the materials and the troops, and without the cargo, the tanks, the jeeps, the munitions, the food, the supplies, the protective gear, everything that they needed to fight the war came to them on these Liberty ships. And without that cargo, without those materials, our troops don't win the war. That's just a fact. So I think when I was standing in that cargo hold, it was the first time where I was able to really appreciate the gravity and the importance of these Liberty ships to the war. So that's one story I just wanted to tell you, being able to experience the SS John W. Brown in person and walking into the ship and stepping into these cargo holds. So the second story I want to tell you has to do with the men and women who built these ships. So to build 2,710 Liberty ships and to build them in an emergency, in a crisis, which is what was happening in the early 1940s, required the essential building of a workforce. We had to create a workforce to build these ships that did not exist. So that was a big part of the story. I really do tell, and I have a copy of the book here with me. I go into that in tremendous detail, the men and women who built these ships. So I want to do a little math for you here. So in 2020, when I started researching this book, if I'm trying to find someone who worked on a Liberty ship, who built the Liberty ships, let's just say hypothetically that person was 20 years old in 1940 when the Liberty ship effort really began, 1941, let's say. So someone was 20 years old back then. That means they were born in like 1920, 1921. That means when I started my research in 2020, 2021, they would have been 100 years old. So as you can imagine, when I started doing my research and really getting into it, I realized pretty quickly that I was looking for people who were going to be 100 years old or older. That was going to be tricky and challenging. And I was pretty realistic and sobering about, the likelihood I was going to be able to find someone. Well, in 2023, I stumbled onto an article. It was an article written up in Maine, and it talked about a celebration that a husband and wife had at a restaurant celebrating their 100th birthdays. And it was at a restaurant, and the story said that both of them, the husband and the wife, had actually worked at the Portland, Maine shipyard building Liberty ships. The husband and the wife had been working on Liberty ships in the war. I was astounded and struck by that. I did a little poking around on their names, and I couldn't really find anything like an obituary or a post on the website Legacy or anything that indicated that they had passed away. I still was skeptical and somewhat sort of questioning that, but I just didn't find anything that said they had passed away. I reached out, I did some searching, and I was able to identify their daughter who was at this birthday party. And I found an email address for her, and I sent her an email. And I told her, I'm writing a book about the Liberty ships of World War II. I read this article up in Maine, and I said, are your parents still with us? And she wrote me back the next day, and she said she was, love to hear from me. She said her mother had unfortunately died about 6 months ago, but that her father, Arthur Babineau, was still with us and was sharp as a tack, in her words, and he would love to share his stories of the war with me. I was over the moon excited. Here was a guy who was in the war, who built Liberty ships, who worked in one of the shipyards in Portland, Maine, which is only a 2-hour drive from my home. It felt like I'd hit the jackpot. We communicated for a couple weeks, and in October of that year, I drove up to Maine, and Donna was her name, Donna Soma. She met me and took me to her house, where I met Arthur Babineau. He came downstairs. Arthur was 102 years old. He was sharp as a tack, as Donna said. He shook my hand firmly. He was a little hunched over. He was a little hard of hearing. But beyond that, we sat down at their kitchen table. And for the better part of, 2 to 3 hours, I sat there and sort of just listened to Arthur tell stories about the war and about the Liberty ships and what his job was. And it was really a moving sort of interview for me. Arthur was, he had met his wife in the shipyard. They were married for 80 years. And it was just this great story of someone who was living in Maine and just sort of identified an opportunity to do work and a job, a good paying job in the war. He got hired, and his job during the war and at the Portland shipyard was to inspect the welds on the ship. The Liberty ships were welded together, and his job was to inspect the welds. And Arthur told me all about his experience and what it was like. And it was just a really sort of powerful experience for me. He was terrific. We took a picture of me with Arthur at the end of the interview, and I left. And I included Arthur's story in the book. It's only a page and a half or 2 pages in a 300-page book, essentially. But it was really important for me to include his story in the book, because he took the time out to share it with me, and I was able to track him down. And it was a first-person account of someone who worked on the Liberty ships, and that was sort of great for me. And to this day, I'm just really grateful that Arthur gave me that time and that interview. Arthur passed away about 6 or 8 months or so after the interview and after it happened. But Donna sent me a note, and I feel like I need to print this out and frame it. Donna sent me a note that said that, Arthur, in his sort of final days, when he was resting, he said to her that he remembered sharing his story of the war with this person who was writing a book. And the fact that he sort of remembered it and it was moving to him, and Donna wanted me to know that sort of our time together had really meant something to him, was important for me and powerful. And I really appreciated her sharing that with me. So anyway, so those are 2 stories I wanted to tell you, because one of them is about visiting and walking on and experiencing a Liberty ship, and the other one is really about the men and women who dedicated their lives and their patriotism and put themselves at risk to sort of build these ships for the betterment of the country and the defending the country's democracy in a time of great peril. So those were 2 stories I wanted to tell you. Now I'm just going to talk briefly about the ships themselves and how they got built. So the ship design, again, looking at this illustration here, the design for this ship is actually not an American design. It's a British design. There was a British ship designer named Robert Thompson, who during the early days of the war, and you have to remember that in 1940, let's say, I'll use round numbers here. In 1940, America was not in World War II. It was not our fight. Pearl Harbor had not happened yet. The fight was going on in Europe. It was Germany and it was Great Britain, and they were fighting a war in Europe. And Americans, for the most part, were very sort of cynical and skeptical about getting involved in that war. They just didn't see it as something they wanted to do. Robert Thompson had designed a cargo ship for the British. They saw this ship as very valuable, and they needed cargo ships for their fight in the war. But the problem was that in Great Britain, all of the shipyards and the where ships were built were being used. They were at capacity. They were being used to build naval ships and military ships or warships, and they couldn't afford to sacrifice and give up one of their shipyards in Great Britain to build cargo ships. They just couldn't make that decision. They asked Robert Thompson if he would be willing to go to America, closest ally of Great Britain, of course, and see if someone in America would help build these ships for Great Britain. Roosevelt and Churchill, of course, had a close relationship, and the hope was that the United States would bend over and do whatever they could to help Great Britain, their closest ally. So Robert Thompson came to the United States, and he met with American officials from the U.S. Maritime Commission. And essentially what the Maritime Commission told Thompson was, we are happy to help you build ships. We understand the desperation that you're facing right now, and we know that this is a vital thing. And America certainly wanted to help Great Britain. They did not want to see Germany defeat Great Britain. That would have been the worst possible outcome for what was happening. But America was in a pickle, because the same thing that was sort of crippling Great Britain was happening in America. All of the shipyards in America were being used to build naval ships, military ships, different kind of boats for the war, to get ready for the war. And we didn't want to give up a shipyard in order to let the Britons build their cargo ships here in America. Instead, what we told Robert Thompson was, you were welcome to go fly around the country, visit with shipyard owners, visit with businessmen, scope out shipyards, and maybe you can identify a dormant shipyard or an empty shipyard or some land that could be turned into a shipyard. And if you can find that, then we're happy to help you build the ships, but you just can't use one of our existing shipyards. That was the catch. So Thompson hears that and decides, okay, I need to go around the country. He rents a plane, and over 3 weeks, he flies 17,000 miles around the country. Seattle, Los Angeles, San Diego, Mobile, Alabama, North Carolina, New Orleans, Tacoma. He really goes all over the country to sort of visit different shipyards and meet with businessmen. And over the course of his travels, he does meet one person in particular who really sort of strikes him as someone who might be helpful. It's a fellow out in Seattle, in Washington, who is not a shipyard owner, and he's not an engineer, and he's not a shipbuilder necessarily. He's just a contractor, a businessman, an interesting guy, but he's just a businessman. But this businessman, when he met with Thompson, said to Thompson, I'll build you 200 of your cargo ships. And Thompson was curious, because he said, I only needed 60. I wasn't asking for 200. I only needed 60 ships. That was the number he had come across with. But now he's being proposed by this businessman that he'll build him 200 ships. He doesn't really know what to make of that. He goes back to Washington. And when he goes back to Washington, he explains who he had met with and tells the folks at the Maritime Commission all the different people he'd met with. Then he tells them the story about this one guy in Seattle who was proposing this ambitious program for him. The Maritime Commission said, oh, we know who that is. That fellow's name is Henry Kaiser. Henry Kaiser actually has a contract with us right now to build 5 ships, just 5. Basically, the first 5 ships he's ever built. He's not a shipbuilder. This was a new kind of contract for him, a new business for him. He was building 5 cargo ships. And as far as they were concerned, the contract was actually going very well. The ships were under budget. They were ahead of schedule. And they were really impressed with Kaiser's work on getting these ships built. They told Robert Thompson, Kaiser might be a good person for you to go meet with again. So Thompson hears that, flies back out to Seattle. And this time, Kaiser's ready for him. And Kaiser, essentially still vowing to build these ships for him, takes Robert Thompson to a mud flat in Richmond, California. So this is a few hundred miles south of where they had first met. Richmond is near San Francisco. It's across the bay. And Thompson sees this vast, empty mud flat. Kaiser says to him, "This is where we're going to build your ships." And Thompson sort of looks at it and doesn't see anything. And he says, "Well, where's the shipyard?" And Kaiser says, "This will be your shipyard. We are going to create a shipyard right here." Thompson now is a little nervous. He's come across from Great Britain. He's been told he has to get 60 ships built in a hurry. And now basically the only offer he has on the table is to work with a guy who's never finished a ship in his life, is not a shipbuilder, is not an engineer, doesn't have a shipyard that he can offer him that's existing, and is just promising to create a shipyard and to build ships and to do all this stuff. And it just feels very sort of skeptical and a little questionable that this is realistic. But Thompson doesn't have a lot of options, and his time is running out. The war in Great Britain is really getting desperate. So Thompson comes back to DC, and they strike a deal. And the deal is that they're going to build 60 cargo ships, 30 in Richmond, California, and 30 on the East Coast. Eventually, the East Coast becomes the Portland, Maine shipyard. And that was important for the United States to spread the work out on both coasts for Great Britain, because they wanted some on the East Coast, some on the West Coast, in the event of an attack, in the event of a shipyard having some difficulties. They didn't want to build them all at one place. They didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. Thompson now has to tell the folks back in Great Britain of his plan. And he's really nervous about that because he realizes this is very different from what he had come across expecting to do. Rather than cable the news back to Great Britain, to his superiors at the Admiralty, he decides, I need to go back and tell them in person. He gets on a boat to go back. And on his way back, with a contract in hand, his boat is torpedoed. His boat is torpedoed and essentially sunk. Everybody on the boat who can get off, and people die, everybody who can get off gets into the lifeboats, and the lifeboats are now rowing in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. They eventually get picked up by another British freighter that's out in the ocean, and they're brought back home. Thompson makes it back home, drenched, sort of his papers are soggy. He has managed to bring his briefcase home that has the contract in it, but it's almost been destroyed. He explains to the British Admiralty, here's the deal I've struck. And they don't really have a choice. Okay, let's do it. And so that's the beginning of what becomes the Liberty Ship program. The United States agrees to build these 60 ships for Great Britain. Those ships are classified as the Ocean class ships, and that's what they're called. These Ocean class ships were the forebearers to the Liberty ships. And they build these 60 ships for the British. And then as that project is unfolding, President Roosevelt announces that the United States is going to get into the cargo ship business as well. And we're going to build our own cargo ships based on this British design. That was a really big decision for Roosevelt to do that. This cargo ship that the United States was building was sort of the most unattractive, hulking, slow. It was nicknamed the Ugly Duckling for a reason. It was just not a pretty ship, and it only traveled 11 knots, barely 12 knots, which is very slow in the ocean. And it was a concern that this ship on the ocean would be a sitting duck for attack. But Roosevelt said that there was one thing about this ship that he was drawn to, and it was this. This ship had a very simple design, not complicated, as you can see from the drawing. And he wanted as many ships as possible, as fast as possible. That was what Roosevelt essentially said. His sort of closest advisors actually advised against building this ship, and they wanted to wait for a better ship to build, something that would last for generations and that would sort of elevate the United States shipbuilding capacity and our might. But Roosevelt looked at it differently. We don't need the best ship, the prettiest ship, the fastest ship, the biggest ship. We just need a lot of ships, and we need them right now. That decision by the president really changed the war because it allowed the United States to find a way to build these ships very quickly. And imagine, keep that number in perspective. Over the course of three and a half years, we built 2,710 of these Liberty ships, plus another 400 of a version of the ship called the Victory ship. So we built more than 3,000 of these ships in a little more than 3 years. So now you're talking about building 1,000 ships a year. Think about that and how that volume was so critical to winning the war, building these cargo ships. So the decision by Roosevelt to build these ships fast was essential. This is the last story I want to tell you, and then I'll take some questions. The initial Liberty ship took approximately 7 to 8 months to build. That's how long it took to build the first of the Liberty ships. The workforce was getting up to speed. The supply chain for all the parts was still getting up to speed. The volume of steel, all the things we needed. The process for building the early Liberty ships, 6 to 8 months. That was obviously far too long. At the end of 1941, when we just got pulled into the war, America had completed 1 Liberty ship. 1. The pace and volume by which that increased very quickly was incredible. By the spring of 1942, we were building across the country 100 Liberty ships a month. So it ramped up dramatically. How did they ramp up the speed so quickly? So one of the things that Henry Kaiser recognized when he set out to build the Liberty ships, Kaiser's philosophy on building things was very simple. If you hire the right workers, you hire the right managers, and you give them the best tools, they can build anything. It was very simple. That was his philosophy on building roads and dams and bridges. Everything that he built was around that philosophy. Hire the right people, give them the right managers, give them the right tools. They can do anything. In the 1940s, there was another famous Henry of the day, and you can all probably know who that is. It was Henry Ford. Kaiser was struck by how Henry Ford was able to pump out 40,000 vehicles a month. How is he doing that? How is he pumping out 40,000 vehicles a month? Kaiser sent an employee up to Detroit to witness and to experience what was happening at Ford and how was he able to build 40,000 vehicles a month. The answer came back very simply. The way he was able to build these cars so quickly and so efficiently was the assembly line. The assembly line manufacturing process was critical to Henry Ford's success. Kaiser looks at the manufacturing process and the assembly line process, and he's like, okay, it's one thing to roll a 15-foot vehicle down an assembly line and have, a group of workers do something here, another group of workers do something here, and another group of workers do something here. That's one thing to do on a 15-foot Model T, let's say. But we're talking about 440-foot ships. You can't roll a 440-foot ship down an assembly line. It doesn't work that way. So he needed to think about how to take this idea of assembly line manufacturing and sort of refashion it for his purposes. What he did and what he recognized was maybe what we need to do is, instead of building the ship, and I'm going to go back to my photos for a minute. So here's some of the construction of the ship. Instead of building the ship in one place from start to finish, so here you can see like the hull of a ship being built and the deck of the ship being built. Instead of building a ship in one place, what if we built the ship in multiple places? Components of the ship built over here, components built over here, components built over here. And then we brought those pieces together. That would allow more people to work on the ship at once, because instead of them all having to be working on the deck or the hull, you could have, 1,000 people over here doing a separate job and 1,000 people over here doing a separate job. The analogy that I like to use is building a Lego toy. So imagine if you opened up a box of Legos and there were 3 bags in it. And if you took one of those bags and told a group of kids, you build that piece. And then you took another bag in the Lego toy and said, you build this piece. And that third bag, you said, you build this piece. Each group of boys built their own component of the Lego toy. Then they all came together and they just snapped them together. How much more quickly would that go than if you just dumped all the toys into one place and tried to build them at once? That's essentially what they did with these shipyards, is they created sort of a prefabrication plant where pieces of the ship could be built in different locations. The most dramatic of those was the deck house. The deck house, you can see it here in the middle of the ship, is like a 3-story building. That was a gigantic piece of the shipbuilding process. But if you built it entirely off-site, away from where the ship was being built, and you had a whole team of people, that's their only job was to build the deck house, that would speed things up dramatically. And then you just bring the deck house and maybe 3 or 4 components out to where the ship was, you hoist it up, plop it on top of the deck, and boom, done. That's essentially what Heinrich Kaiser did. And that's how he was able to dramatically reduce the amount of time it took to build the Liberty ships. The speed at which the Liberty ships got built dropped from 6 months to 4 months to 2 months, eventually down to 1 month on average to complete the Liberty ships. 1 month. So they were really doing it fast and efficiently and really remarkably. One thing Heinrich Kaiser was really good at was marketing. He was a smart marketer. And Kaiser eventually decided that, I want to get Americans excited about the Liberty ship. How do I do that? It's a boring, hulking, steel, ugly cargo ship. How do I get Americans excited about this? He was excited about it. He was excited about what was happening at the shipyards, but no one else seemed to be paying attention to it. Kaiser told 2 of his shipyards. He had one in Portland, Oregon, and he had one in Richmond, California. The one in Portland was run by his son, Edgar. He told his 2 shipyard managers, you are officially in competition with each other. Which of you can build the fastest Liberty ship? And it was like an Olympic competition, since the Olympics are about to start now. So he told these 2 shipyards, you're in competition, who can build the fastest Liberty ship? And in the fall of 1942, these 2 shipyards set out on a race. The first one came from Portland, Oregon, and they finished a Liberty ship in 26 days. So again, the average time was somewhere around 30, so they built it in 26 days, really fast. Richmond, California responded a couple weeks later, and they finished and launched a ship in 18 days. Okay, so now they knocked 8 full days off of that. Dramatic. That's a big difference. A couple weeks after that, Portland, Oregon responded and built the ship in 10 days. They finished the Liberty ship in 10 days. When they finished that ship, so confident were they that that was going to be the record and not beatable. They invited President Roosevelt to come out to Portland and to help launch the ship. And he did. And they launched that ship after 10 days, and they celebrated. The shipbuilders in Richmond, California were not impressed. And they said, we can beat 10 days. And they essentially compiled every idea they possibly could. How do we cut 2 hours here, 3 hours here, 1 hour here, 20 minutes here? Any idea you can come up with to trim some time off of building a little Liberty ship. We want to hear about it. On November 7th, 1942, at midnight, a whistle blew, and the shipyard workers in Richmond, California set out to build the fastest Liberty ship. They worked around the clock in shifts, 24/7, and in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, they launched the SS Robert E. Peary. That became the model after which nothing else could compete. A 4-day ship. And Henry Kaiser was right, because the next day, newspapers around the country wrote stories about Kaiser's shipyard launching a 4-day ship. And it was marketed, and it was brilliant, and it got buzz. Newspapers around the country writing about cargo ships and Liberty ships and Henry Kaiser. And he achieved his goal of building buzz around a boring, hulking, steel, slow cargo ship. So those are some stories I wanted to share with you today. The Robert E. Peary ship ended up, people often ask me, did it float? Not only did the Robert E. Peary ship float, it served the war dramatically. It appeared at the beaches of Normandy and helping troops there. It served for the full length of the duration of the war and was very valuable, and was a terrific ship. The story of the Liberty ships, to me, the reason I wrote this book and the reason it was important to me, I felt like it was sort of an underappreciated story of the war. I feel like it there have been thousands and thousands of books written about World War II. And I felt like this was a fascinating, interesting story about people, about the human spirit, and about sort of the fight to defend our democracy. And it was a story that I felt like hadn't really been told. And so I was excited to do that. So I will stop there. Thank you for listening. Thank you for indulging me and being here today. It's a snowy, chilly day here in New England. But I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to answer questions and things that I didn't talk about or whatever you want to chat about.
That was great, Doug. Not surprisingly at all. There are already a number of questions in the queue and 4 raised hands here. Okay, why don't I go to the raised hands? I'll start with, looks like Mark, you're first in line. If you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, and I'm
Sure.
glad you were able to talk to the guy in Portland, Maine, who had worked on it. That's awesome. My question, it might be outside of your field, but I was wondering, there's a bit of a chicken and the egg sort of thing between the size of the Liberty ship
Yeah.
and the size of U.S. tanks that they could build. There's a reason why one of the reasons why the U.S. made medium tanks is because they could put it in a Liberty ship and send them over, whereas the Germans with internal lines didn't have to worry about that, and they could build bigger tanks. I'm wondering, did the Liberty ship come first, or did the Sherman design come first to say, oh, okay, so basically did the Americans have the Liberty ship in mind when they were developing the Sherman?
As far as I know, no. So essentially, they did not design a special tank that could fit into a Liberty ship, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
The ships had on the deck gigantic sort of I'm blanking on the word, but essentially the cargo hold where they would remove the plate in order to lower things into the cargo hold was really big. And that cargo hold essentially could, accommodate really big boxes. In fact, some airplanes were boxed up and put on Liberty ships because the plane could fly across. So they did not design a special tank just for the Liberty ship. The Liberty ship was big enough to hold, like you said, sort of the medium-sized tanks, not the gigantic tanks, although they did take some of those across, but those were put on the deck of the ship rather than lowered into the holes of the ship.
You mean the Pershing tank?
Correct. So those could fit on the deck of the ship, but they wouldn't go inside the ship. So you obviously then couldn't carry as many of them. But they were able to carry some of those tanks. But it was the medium-sized tank that was really, for the most part, carried in bulk numbers on the Liberty ship. Those are the ones they could box up, stack up, and really carry in great volume across.
Just like the Liberty ships. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the question. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. Gary, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question, and then Brandon, I'll go to you.
One thing I just want to say to everyone before we finish is real quick. If we don't get to a question or if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to email me. My website is very simple. It's just dougmost.com. It's my name. And on there's a contact form. You can send me an email. And I'm also happy to, if you buy the book and it's for a gift or it's for someone you want to send it to, if you write me a note, I can send you a signed nameplate, which sort of looks like this and has my signature on it. And I can personalize it if you tell me to personalize it too. So I just want to let people know that even if you're not in Boston or in my area, but you want a signed book copy, I can make that happen. You just have to shoot me an email. I just wanted to say that real quick. Hi, Gary.
Okay, hi. So just real quick, my late father-in-law worked in the Kaiser Yards in Richmond. He was trained as a welder through some sort of, I believe, New Deal program a little bit earlier, like 1941 or something.
Yep.
And then he welded there for most of the duration of the war, until one day he got persnickety, decided to quit, and then got drafted like quickly thereafter, and soon
Right.
found himself at Nagasaki not too many days after it had been bombed. So, but anyway, that's my little story. So, a couple wonky questions here. What were the main differences between the Ocean class and the? My understanding is basically the same as the Ocean class, except they converted it to use oil instead of coal. I believe the Ocean class were coal burning because Britain had coal and didn't have oil like in the UK itself.
Right.
And then you see a lot of like booms and cranes on the deck of these ships. So were they generally unloaded with their own booms and stuff? I know this is really a niche question, but
No, it's
it
okay. It's a
interests me.
very,
Or did they generally use the crane, whatever was available, or I guess it probably depended on what the facilities were, but
yeah.
I'm just curious, like what were the capacity of those cranes and that sort of thing. So,
So
and
yeah, so
I guess that's it. Thank you.
yeah, no, they're good questions. So you're right about the first one. Yes, the U.S. If you put the two ships, the Ocean class ships and Liberty ships, next to each other, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So they were essentially the identical ship. In fact, the biggest challenge for America was we needed to modify the specs and the blueprints and the designs for American shipyards because everything was done in British measurements with British tools for British shipbuilders. And now we needed to essentially Americanize that for American shipyards and American tools and American measurements. That was one of the biggest challenges we had to do. And they hired William Francis Gibbs to do that, who was really one of the leading ship designers in the world at the time to do that. So the oil was one of the things. You're right. Coal versus oil was a factor. That was, one of the, I would say, minor modifications that was made. It was not a big change that they had to make. But the ship design itself was really not changed at all from the Ocean class to the Liberty ship. It was essentially an identical ship. And the cranes. So, yeah, one of the big challenges was, how heavy the crane would be. The cranes could be to lift the things. The design that came over from the British included a whirly crane that was really only capable of lifting like 5 tons. And it was decided that that wasn't nearly enough. We needed something that could lift up much more than that. And so they designed a heavier, stronger whirly crane on the ship that could hoist a much bigger weight, 25, even up to 50 tons if necessary, that could really sort of sturdily and strongly hoist big, big tanks and other things that weighed a lot to get them up onto the ship. And so that was one of the more important and critical modifications, was designing stronger booms and stronger whirly cranes that could carry and lift much bigger weights. And one of the bigger things they had to lift was the pieces of the deck house in order to lift up the deck house and plop it on top of the ship. That was a very heavy component of the ship that they needed to be able to lift up. So that was an important change. The design for the British ship was really for smaller lifting, and they had to build much stronger booms and much stronger cranes in order to be able to accommodate what they needed on the Liberty ship.
So literally, they were able to and did load and unload like Sherman tanks with their own deck gear.
They did. Now, sometimes they had to use more than one crane at the same time. So in other words, 2 cranes would sometimes grab it and do it together.
Right.
And that's how they did the deck house. The deck house pieces were so big that it wasn't one crane alone lifting. There was like 4 cranes that would lift up a piece. But still, yes, it was their own cranes, their own booms that they built and designed that could lift up this very heavy equipment.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I gotta say, Doug, the more questions you answer, the more questions are coming into the queue, which is always a good sign. Brandon, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, Doug, I have a couple comments and questions. How do you translate this into modern ships? So in other words, today we talk about container ships. This seems closest to, but there's also bulkers, which carry things like grains and things. Did the Liberty ships get used for both? Clearly not for liquids like tankers, but did they do both things? And why, like the Curtis Jennies after World War I kind of kicked off this whole interest in flying. They were widely used, for barnstorming and everything. What became of the Liberty ships? I'm stunned to hear there's only two left, given that they built 3,000 plus,
Right, right.
when we have more battleships than that left, which is a lot harder to maintain.
Yeah.
So what happened with them after the war?
So they persevered on, and they served different purposes. They were used in the 1950s and 60s for, some cargo purposes, and they brought goods and services to other countries when we needed them. But they were not really needed as much, and it was one of the big debates about how long a shelf life these ships would have. But they just were not, because they were so slow. They were not very efficient ships. They just were, it was a lot to load up a cargo ship in the 50s and 60s and have it travel, 11 knots. We got better and built faster ships. So that was one of the things. The ships, we lost about 300 ships in the war. So of the 2,710 that were built, we lost roughly 300 in the war. The vast majority of them were scrapped for their steel in the 60s. That was the steel was very valuable and it was useful for other things. So they were scrapped for their steel. A couple of them lived on and continued to have long lives and be used for other purposes. Weirdly, the weirdest story, I think you could say, the SS John W. Brown, the one that I visited in Baltimore, was actually used as a public school in New York City for about 20 years. It went to New York City and it was used there as a public school for a long time. So that was a quirky use for an abandoned Liberty ship. So that's sort of what happened to the ships. And then as far as whether they were used for bulk, you're right, they were not used to carry liquids. As far as I know, they were not used for sort of the purposes you described, like these bulk sort of things. That's not how they were designed, and that's not what their purpose was. They were, the current cargo ships, like you said, that you talk about today, they're built in a very different way. Now you see the boxes of stuff piled high on top of the ship, which is a different look than what you see for the Liberty ship. It wasn't designed in a way to stack huge amounts of cargo on top of it, although they did use the deck for cargo. But that's not simply how it was designed, whereas the cargo ships of today are just designed very differently. So they are, I think we've evolved in how the ships are being used and built. I met the other day or the other week, I should say, with a company that's near me called Blue Water Autonomy. And they're a fascinating company, and they're essentially building the Liberty ship of the future. And it's this autonomous sort of like drone ship that wouldn't require a crew on it, and that can be repaired at sea, sort of like the Tesla can be repaired on its own. Think of it that way. So they're building these autonomous ships that really are sort of the future of cargo ships. So technology has certainly changed so dramatically from when it was during the war. That's allowed us to sort of try different things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, Brandon. Mike Jankowitz, of course. Mike, if you want to ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Very good talk. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I just have one comment and two questions, actually. But the comment is just that there was in the upper Hudson River, well, actually, depending upon your point of view, for those of us in New York City, the upper Hudson River, there was for a couple of decades, the mothball fleets.
Right.
And they were sitting there, viewable, but not much used for many years. But
right, viewable but not visitable.
Right, exactly, yes. But the two questions are this. So you have a Liberty ship, and it can hold about, I think you said 440 tanks, let's say. But especially because of its speed and high profile, it can get sunk.
Yep.
And if it gets sunk and it's carrying 440 tanks,
right,
you lost the ship and 440 tanks.
Correct.
Did they take this into account as far as deciding how much of let's say, how many tanks, how many aircraft, how many jeeps would be on any one ship? I mean, was this the potential loss
Right.
factor? Was that taken into account? And the second question has to do with well, Kaiser, the Kaiser name, Henry Kaiser, in the United States, at least, is often associated with a with a substance which some of us, a few of us like me, call aluminium, but most people here call aluminum.
Yeah.
How did that factor into the making of the ship, especially since it was lighter weight, but also more penetrable?
So, all right. So the first question, the answer is, I guess, in a word, no. The idea was, you know, we knew that some of these ships were going to go down in the Atlantic or the Pacific. It was going to happen. But the thinking was, and the strategy was, we have to build more ships than the Germans can sink. We have to build ships faster than the Germans can sink them. So if that were to happen, if a ship got sunk, don't worry, because right behind it, we've got 10 more coming. And that was sort of the philosophy and the strategy, was we just have to keep pumping them out there. And yes, you're right. When they did get sunk, the Germans really took tremendous pride and delight in sinking the Liberty ships, because they knew that it was FDR's sort of pride and joy, these ships. And so when they were spotted on the ocean, it was like, oh, that's a Liberty ship. And not only is it a Liberty ship, it's lightly armed, slow. This will be an easy, quick win. We'll take this ship down in 20 minutes. And for the most part, that's usually what happened. The ships were not equipped to really put up a good fight. They were very lightly armed. There's a famous battle that took place, and I write about it in the book. I devote a whole chapter to it. The SS Stephen Tompkins was at sea, and it was attacked by a German raider. And like all those attacks, everybody thought that fight would last 20 minutes and it would be over. But in fact, the Tompkins put up a fierce fight against this German ship. And in the end, both ships were sunk. And the crew of the SS Stephen Tompkins were hailed as heroes for being a Liberty ship that took down a German battleship. And there's a dramatic story behind that, and I tell it in the book about how that fight unfolded and the men who were killed and sort of put up the fight, and how they managed to take down a German battleship with essentially machine guns and nothing else. So it was just a sacrifice of the war. You know, these ships were going to get sunk. It was going to happen, and you would deal with that. As far as aluminum, you know, these ships were built with steel, and aluminum was not really a factor for the most part in the building of the ships. Kaiser gets into aluminum a little later, and he gets into concrete as well, and he gets into a lot of things that are critical to construction. But during the war, he really was invested in steel, and that's where his effort was, because these ships were built from steel. So aluminum was less of a factor on these ships. It was not invisible, but it was less of a factor, and the steel really was just where all the energy was put.
Well, just to follow up on the first question, but did they do anything with how many tanks? In other words, did they load the ship up with as many tanks as possible, knowing that those tanks would go down with the ship?
They did. They did not make like calculations and say like, well, we should only put 200 on this one because there's a risk it might go down. They didn't do that way. What they did do was the ships would travel in convoys. So the ships would travel surrounded by military ships and military vessels to try to protect them. So that way they were not sitting ducks on the ocean. And that was the big factor that helped protect them. But sometimes on the ocean, a convoy would have to scatter. And when that happened, the Liberty ship would be sort of left as a sitting duck by itself. And that's when the attacks would happen. But they did not make these calculated decisions to say, well, don't put too much on that ship because it might go down. Just load it up and cross our fingers.
Well, I know about the convoys. Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for the question, Mike. Rick, Rick Nelson, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, maybe someone might comment on that convoy question. Did the convoy know the most valuable ships, the ones that may have had 441 tanks on it, and therefore been more protective of it. So I don't know of convoy protocol, but I imagine being on the outside was kind of the worst thing you could be as a ship. So, but that wasn't my question. My question, which you kind of touched upon, was what armament was there on the ships? And you commented on that one battle, but how many engagements did they have? Did they shoot planes down, or was it rare that those guns were productively used?
Yeah, so I guess the best thing to say is it was a big debate when they were deciding how much armament to put on these ships. Was a big debate. And in the end, they just decided there would be 2 stations with machine guns where someone could sit, in a chair and shoot a machine gun. And so that would help against an airplane attack, for example. And other than that, there were machine guns that the crew could run and get and fire, on their own. But they were lightly armed ships. They were just not, the decision was made like, these are not military ships. That's not what they're equipped for. Remember also, the ships were built in a way where they couldn't carry big crews. They only had a crew of like 40 men. And of that 40, 30 were typically the merchant marines and 10 were like Navy personnel. So they just were not equipped in any way to be battleships, to be true battleships. So that meant that when they were attacked, they were very vulnerable to going down. And they could put up a fight, and the goal was when they would put up a fight to try to hold off the sinking of the ship for 20 to 30 minutes, enough time to get the crew off into the lifeboat so they could get away. But they knew that once they were attacked, the likelihood of saving that ship was slim. That's why the convoys were so critical. I don't know, I can't answer specifically about whether in a convoy, did they know which ship had what cargo. I'm sure they did, and I'm sure they would try to protect them. The goal of the convoys was obviously to just protect all the ships. And they were all valuable. But I don't know specifically if they would sort of like let that one go, but protect that one. I don't know if that was sort of a calculation they would make in those convoys.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Doug, we've got about 10 questions in the queue. How are you for time? I can read them out to you. So do this.
Yeah, give me a couple more.
All right.
And send them all to me if you want, like type them or copy them into an email and send them to me.
Totally. From owner, I've been told that many Liberty ships presumed lost to U-boats actually were lost to metal fatigue caused by the cold ocean waters of the North Atlantic. Can you comment on this idea?
Sure. So there was questions about the durability of the Liberty ship, right? How would they hold up on the ocean? For the most part, they held up great, and they were strong and they were sturdy, and the welding and the steel worked. But as the war went on, some cracks started to develop in some Liberty ships. There were some cracks that developed. Some ships could be repaired. So the cracks, they would go into a shipyard, they'd get repaired, they'd be put back out to sea. They were still fine. Some ships were unrepairable and would be scrapped. And then eventually what happened was sort of later in the war, it was decided that, we've seen enough cracks develop in some ships that we want to make some modifications to the ship. And they made some slight modifications to the ships, including putting a little faster engine on it. And the steel was considered one of the factors in some of these cracks developing, substandard steel in some of them. And some of the welds were also some of the factors. And they made these modifications, and that's when the Victory ship was built. And so the Victory ship was a slightly different ship than the Liberty ship. If you put them next to each other, they would sort of look almost identical, but not quite. I consider them to be like fraternal twins, very close in look, but not identical. And they built about 400 of the Victory ships toward the end of the war to replace the Liberty ship. And so that's how they got around some of the cracks that developed. But the cracks did not sink hundreds and hundreds of ships. It was not that kind of dramatic thing. They just affected some ships, but not a vast majority or quantity of them.
Excellent. Steve writes 2 questions. How many were lost in combat during the war, and what happened to the surviving ships apart from the 2? And I heard you mention the one repurposed?
Yeah, so like I said before, as far as we know, somewhere between 200 and 300 were lost to battle during the war, considered lost. That means they were either sunk or they were damaged so heavily that they couldn't be repaired, or they just sort of were fatigued and couldn't finish. So roughly 200 to 300 did not finish the war, if you want to think of it that way, or did not sort of survive the war. And then, what was the other piece of that question? Sorry.
Besides the 2 or 3 that you mentioned,
Yeah.
were the others repurposed post-war?
Right. I mean, some were repurposed. They did, like I said, plenty of them sailed on through the 50s, into the 60s. Hundreds of them did have shelf lives after the war, but starting in the 1960s, a lot of them began to be scrapped for the metal. The steel was valuable. The steel could be used for other purposes, and so that's really what started to happen. The ships were just not deemed to be sort of like long-term purposed ships that could be used for again and again for decades to come.
Great. Philip, please talk about the relationship of the Liberty Ship program to other contemporaneous shipbuilding programs. I feel like you just answered this, particularly the LST, in terms of influence on how programs were structured and competition for resources and building ways.
Yeah, it's funny. I need to do a little more research on this because a couple of people have brought up the LST to me, and I don't have a great answer for you. I think one of the things that I took away from the Liberty Ship program that I think is a lesson, and I'm actually writing an op-ed about this now that I'm hoping to finish in the next week or so. One of the lessons that I took away from the Liberty Ship program that I think can be applied to today was that decision I talked about earlier. America, I think, wants to be known as building the best of everything. And if Roosevelt had made that decision to build the best cargo ship, things would have turned out very differently. And I think there's something to be said for sacrificing quantity, or sacrificing quality for quantity, I should say. And this idea right now, there is no question that China is outbuilding the United States when it comes to ships. 3-to-1, essentially, the number of ships they're building versus us. It's enormous. They're just outbuilding us dramatically. The only way we're going to catch up is if we recognize that, we got to build ships fast. And maybe we don't have to build the best ship and the most amazing ship ever and be so proud of it that's like the greatest ship ever built. But instead, we just need to build ships fast. We need the workforce, we need the shipyards, we need to get them built. That was what Roosevelt was willing to do. He was willing to sacrifice a little bit of his ego and not build the greatest ship ever, instead build this ugly piece of steel. But he just wanted them fast. And I think that is the most valuable lesson we could take away from the Liberty Ship program to today. We need to build ships quickly, not the best ship.
Okay. Reed Bennett has multiple questions. Reed, I may read 2 and then pass on Doug's contact to you. 2 questions. At Richmond, California, where the ships were built, there is a Rosie the Riveter plaque. It's my understanding other Liberty shipyards claim to have Rosie. Is there any specific Rosie, or was she a composite? I think that's the question.
Okay. So this slide here. So I didn't talk about this, but I really do dive into the book a lot. So Rosie the Riveter was obviously a character that was a sort of a compilation of the women who were instrumental in the war in working on sort of riveting so much of the war arsenal of democracy together. What happened with the Liberty ships that was fascinating is that because the ships were welded and not riveted, that was a different skill that women needed to learn. And so they became known as Wendy the Welder. And Wendy the Welder, I refer to as like a cousin of Rosie the Riveter, if you want to think of it that way. And it was also a composite, but the women welders were terrific, and they were actually better at welding than the men in the war. And they played a critical role in the building of the Liberty ship. So yes, there is a Rosie the Riveter monument out in California, but California also sort of recognizes that welding played a critical role in the building of the Liberty ships, not riveting, which is where riveting was happening up with Henry Ford's plant and in other places with the airplanes, with the tanks, but not with the Liberty ships. They were welded, not riveted.
Perfect segue to iPhone 79's question. What new welding techniques were required to fabricate these ships?
So it wasn't so much that it was new welding techniques, it was that they really had to just get better at them. So welding was welding. It's a skill that they needed to use to build these ships. And the women, what they learned, were really good at it because welding requires a certain dexterity with your arm to reach into tight spaces with the welding tools. And it required a dexterity and strength and agility that women had better than men. And women held contests with the welding, who could be the fastest welder. They were invited to the White House to meet with Eleanor Roosevelt, whoever the fastest welder was. It was a big deal. And so it wasn't so much a new welding skill as it was a just get better at welding and faster at welding. One of the stories I tell in the book is about a woman who went undercover at one of the shipyards and wrote a diary about her experience building Liberty ships called Diary of a Shipbuilder. And it was a fascinating book, and it really did give you great insight into how they worked there, and it plays an important part in my book.
Excellent. Charles asks, who was Pete Newell? You have a slide with his name on it.
Yeah, Pete Newell, thank you for mentioning that. Pete Newell, where is that slide? He was the gentleman who ran the Portland, Maine shipyard. So he was a shipbuilder up in Maine, and he went to MIT. He was an engineer, and he was the owner of the shipyards up in Portland, Maine, that built those first 30 ocean-class ships for the British, and then continued to build Liberty ships up there. And that's the shipyard where the man that I met, Arthur Babineau, worked. So Pete Newell was really the East Coast partner for the government and for the Maritime Commission in building the Liberty ships.
Great. We'll take our last question from Joe, who asked, did you break down the number of Liberty ships which went to the Allies, particularly the USSR?
I did not break that down. I know that, like I said, the 60 went to the British, the ocean-class ships, but I did not break down sort of what Liberty ships went elsewhere. Most of the Liberty ships we built were for us. They were not for other countries. But I don't have numbers, sorry.
No worries. I think that's a great way to end it. Thank you to our speaker for a great lecture and Q&A. Again, the book is Launching Liberty, The Epic Race to Build the Ships That Took America to War by Doug Most. Please join us next Saturday, February 14th at 1 p.m. when historian Craig Luther will discuss his book, Moscow Tram Stop, A Doctor's Experience with the German Spearhead in Russia. First published in 1957 and out of print for decades, Moscow Tram Stop is a classic of World War II on the Eastern Front, and Craig is the military history editor of that book, and it's a wonderful book, and it's a great talk. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Till then, take care, and Doug, very big thank you for today's talk.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And like I said, if anyone wants to reach out, feel free to just go to my website. You can contact me there directly. I'm very quick to respond. So thanks for your time. Thanks, Greg, for doing this. Appreciate it.
Yeah. And Doug, it's dougmost.com, the website?
Dougmost.com, correct. Dougmost.com.
Perfect. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, everyone. We'll see everyone next week. Take care.